A single step into the cold, shallow waters of a minor stream is all it takes to dismantle 5 centuries of tradition. Imagine standing at the edge of a boundary that is not just physical, but legal, spiritual, and existential. Behind you lies the glory of a conquered wilderness, the echoes of a decade of struggle, and the loyalty of men who have forgotten how to fear. In front of you lies the law of your fathers, a city that fears your name, and a death warrant signed by those you once called friends. This is not just a river, it is a point of no return. If you stop, you are a ghost of history, a relic to be discarded by the elite. If you cross, you are a traitor, a rebel, and perhaps, the master of the world. The water is ink black, the air is stagnant, and the weight of an entire civilization rests on the sole of a single boot. The story of this crossing does not begin at the riverbank, but amidst the suffocating dust and psychological warfare of a fortress called Alesia in 52 BC. Years before the world changed at the Rubicon, it was forged in the fires of a desperate siege. Within the walls of Alesia, a man named Vercingetorix watched his dreams of a free Gaul slowly turn into a nightmare of starvation and silence. He was a leader of forests and ancient alliances, a man who had united tribes that had spent centuries at each other's throats. But he was facing a machine, not just of steel and wood, but of relentless, cold logic. Outside the walls, Julius Caesar had constructed a cage of unprecedented scale, a double line of fortifications that kept the defenders in and their hope out. It was a masterpiece of architectural dominance, a physical manifestation of a mind that refused to accept the possibility of failure. Inside the fortress, the situation was gruesome. The air was heavy with the scent of rotting waste and the metallic tang of blood. Supplies had vanished weeks ago. Men chewed on leather straps to dull the pangs of hunger, while the elders debated the impossible choice of who would live to see the next sunrise. Vercingetorix, once a symbol of defiant life, became a specter of duty. He watched from the ramparts as the Roman legions worked with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. They weren't just soldiers, they were engineers of doom, digging miles of earthworks while under constant threat. To the Gauls, the Romans seemed less like men and more like a force of nature that had learned to bend the earth itself to its will. When Vercingetorix finally realized that no relief army was coming to save them, the silence that fell over Alesia was more deafening than the sounds of battle. On the day of surrender, he did not come out as a broken beggar, but as a king performing a funeral rite for his own people. He donned his most ornate armor, his horse groomed to a shine that mocked the surrounding filth. He rode out of the gates and circled the seated Caesar in a ritual of submission that felt like a curse. He threw his weapons at Caesar's feet without a word. It was a quiet affair, marked only by the heavy breathing of tired men and the clatter of bronze on stone. At that moment, Caesar was at the height of his power, yet the seeds of his destruction were already being sown in the shadows of the Roman Senate. While Caesar was subduing the wilds of Gaul, the Roman Senate was transforming into a theater of paranoia. This was a body of men who thrived on the delicate balance of shared power, and they watched Caesar's influence grow with absolute terror. They saw the reports coming back, the maps being redrawn, the wealth flowing into Caesar's personal coffers, and most importantly, the undying devotion of his legions. To the elite in Rome, Caesar was no longer a servant of the Republic, he was a perceived threat, a force that challenged the system they had built to protect their own interests. They didn't see a hero, they saw a man who had outgrown the narrow corridors of the law. In Rome, when a man becomes larger than the law is often used as a blunt instrument to bring him down. The conflict was never about right or wrong, it was about the collision of two incompatible realities. On one side was the Republic, a crumbling structure of checks and balances that had become a playground for the entrenched nobility. On the other side was a new vision of efficiency and centralized authority, embodied by a man who had spent a decade in the mud and the cold, learning that results matter more than procedures. The letters traveling between Caesar's camp and the Senate were filled with hidden threats and legal traps. Every offer of compromise was a masked demand for total submission. The Senate, led by the pride of Pompey the Great, a man who had once been Caesar's ally and son-in-law, demanded that Caesar lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen to face trial. Caesar knew the reality of that invitation. To return without his army was to walk into a cage far more restrictive than the one he had built at Alesia. He would be stripped of his honors, his achievements would be erased from the record, and his life would be at the mercy of men who envied his every breath. He would be prosecuted for technicalities, his reputation dragged through the dirt of the forum until there was nothing left but a memory of a failure. The tension began to vibrate through the ranks of his soldiers. These were men who had survived the winters of the north and the ferocity of the tribes. They were no longer merely the soldiers of Rome, they were the soldiers of Caesar. They saw the Senate's demands not as a matter of justice, but as a betrayal of their sacrifice. As the winter of 49 BC settled over the northern Italian border, Caesar moved his headquarters to Ravenna. The stillness in the city was chilling, a heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to swallow the sound of footsteps. Caesar sat in the dim light of his quarters, surrounded by maps and scrolls, a man balanced on a razor's edge. He sent his final proposal to Rome, a gesture of peace that asked only for fairness, but in the halls of the Senate, it was read as an ultimatum. The messengers who returned to him brought stories of chaos in the streets and the flight of his allies, the tribunes, who had been threatened with violence. The political machine had jammed, and the only way to clear it was through a decisive, irreversible motion. The Rubicon, a small, unremarkable river that served as the boundary between his province and the heartland of Italy, became the focus of the world's destiny. To cross it with an army was an act of civil war, a capital offense that could never be forgiven. On the night of the crossing, the atmosphere was drained of color. Caesar did not move with the thunder of a conqueror, but with the calculated stillness of a gambler who knows the house is rigged. He dined with friends, masking the turmoil within, laughing and discussing trivialities, before slipping away under the cover of darkness. He traveled in a simple carriage pulled by mules, seeking the point where the road met the water. When he reached the bank, he paused. The silence of the night must have been deafening, broken only by the gentle flow of the stream and the occasional shift of a horse's hoof. To cross meant the end of the world as he knew it. It meant that every friend he had left in Rome would become a foe. It meant that the soil of Italy would soon be marked by the footprints of its own sons in conflict. The risk was total. There was no middle ground, no room for retreat once the first hoof hit the water. It was a thriller in the purest sense, a man standing before an abyss, realizing that the only way to survive is to jump. The internal conflict must have been agonizing for a man who deeply respected the traditions of his people, yet he saw those traditions being used to strangle the very future they were meant to protect. The Republic was struggling to maintain its own weight, and he was perhaps the only one with the courage to provoke the final collapse. He looked at the water and saw not a river, but a mirror reflecting the face of a man who was about to trade his soul for the chance to save his life and his legacy. He turned to his companions and spoke the words that have echoed through the corridors of time: the die is cast. It was an admission that the outcome was no longer in his hands, but in the hands of fate. With that, he led his small contingent into the stream. The water was cold, cutting through the silence of the pre-dawn hour. As they reached the other side, the transition was complete. In the eyes of the law, Caesar was no longer a general, he was a ghost walking among the living, a man who had declared war on the state by simply moving his feet. The Republic did not die with a scream, it died with the quiet splashing of water against Roman leather. The news of the crossing moved through Italy like a chill, striking the hearts of the elite in Rome. They had expected a long, drawn-out legal battle, a series of negotiations and delays. They had not expected a man to simply walk through the door they had tried to lock. Panic replaced the arrogance of the Senate. Pompey, the great champion of the old order, found himself unprepared for a man who moved with the speed of a lightning strike. The system that had functioned for centuries was suddenly revealed to be a hollow shell, unable to cope with a single individual who had the audacity to ignore the rules of the game. The elite fled Rome in a disorganized scramble, leaving behind their homes, their wealth, and the very institutions they claimed to protect. The march toward Rome was not a campaign of destruction, but a psychological takeover. Town after town opened its gates, not out of love, but out of a recognition that the old world had already vanished. Caesar moved with a terrifying clemency. He refused to punish those who had opposed him, which only served to unnerve his enemies further. He was not acting like a typical rebel, he was acting like a ruler who had already claimed a throne that didn't yet exist. The tension lay in this realization, that the figure the Senate feared was not a man of mindless violence, but a man of absolute, calm efficiency who could dismantle their entire reality without breaking his stride. While Caesar marched, his old rival Vercingetorix sat in a dark cell in Rome, a forgotten trophy of a previous war. The tragedy of the Gallic leader served as a grim foreshadowing for the Republic itself. Both had been outmaneuvered by a mind that saw the world not as it was, but as it could be forced to become. Vercingetorix would eventually be strangled in the darkness of a dungeon, a sacrifice to the new order Caesar was building. The fall of the Republic was a slow-motion collapse of a foundation that had been rotting for decades. Alesia had been the final test of the Roman military machine, and the Rubicon was the moment that machine turned inward to reshape its creator. The transition from Republic to Empire was not a sudden explosion, but a series of quiet, inevitable choices. It was the moment when the collective will of a people was traded for the singular vision of one man. Looking back, the crossing represents the ultimate risk of power. It shows us that the structures we build to govern ourselves are only as strong as the consensus that supports them. When that consensus fails, when the mists of mistrust and ambition cloud the vision of those in charge, the world changes in the blink of an eye. The Senate thought they were protecting the law, but they were merely protecting their own status, and in doing so, they invited the very thing they feared most. The water of the Rubicon eventually washed away the stains of the march, but the map of human civilization was permanently altered. The Republic, with its noisy debates and complex laws, was eventually silenced, replaced by the quiet, absolute authority of the Caesars. The impact of that single step at the riverbank still stretches across our modern world, a haunting echo of the night when a man decided that he was the only solution to a failing system. The risk he took was enormous, the conflict was existential, and the result was the birth of an empire that would define the Western mind for 2 millennia. As we stand at our own metaphorical riverbanks, facing the tensions of our own era, the story of the crossing serves as a cautionary tale. It tells us that when the mechanisms of society can no longer contain the ambitions and the grievances of the people, the rules become nothing more than lines in the sand, easily crossed and quickly forgotten. The darkness of this history is not in the violence that follows, but in the cold, clear logic that leads a man to the water's edge and whispers that there is no other way. The die is cast, not by chance, but by the relentless pressure of a world that has lost its way, waiting for a single step to change everything forever. The impact that Caesar left upon the banks of the Rubicon remains fixed in history. It serves as a reminder that the boundary between order and chaos is often thinner than we dare to believe. The sense of the north, the silence of the camps at Ravenna, and the cold water of the stream all converge into a single moment of absolute choice. In that moment, the general became a king in all but name, the general's law became the state's law, and the republic became a memory. We are left to wonder if the crossing was an act of salvation or a final betrayal, but the result remains the same: the world was never the same again. In the end, history does not remember the legal arguments or the fine print of the Senate's decrees. It remembers the sound of the water, the stillness of the night, and the man who dared to walk through the gate that was meant to stay shut. The story ends not with a resolution, but with a transformation. The tension of the Rubicon is the tension of human ambition itself, the drive to break the old to make way for the new, even if the new is born of fire and uncertainty. The story is a mirror, reflecting our own fears of the moment when the structures we rely on finally fail, and we are forced to decide which side of the river we truly belong on. The water is waiting, and the choice is always there, hidden in the dark.